Chapter 7. A Little Too Much Excitement. Heath woke with a start from a nightmare of being strangled to death by a moonjade-enhanced Pithecus. He was, of course, still several hundred feet in the air, so one could never have got onto the ship, but it took far too long to realize the problem. Bones had been lying on top of his chest. Little else but her eyes were visible in the soft moonlit dark, and little else but the sound of rain could be heard, but this close up, those eyes seemed to see almost into him. He shoved the plaidie off his hammock, and fumbled for the waterskin he kept tucked under his pillow. He was still uncomfortably warm, so he tugged his shirt off and dropped it on the floor. Then, hearing a strange noise on the ship, he reached for the other thing he always tucked under his pillow, a long, sharp hunting knife. Then, with a soft shuffling noise approaching, he peered into the dark until a gracefully drifting Cordetta materialized from the shadows. She was wearing a white silk nightgown, with lace trimming outlining the tight fit it made against her body. With each sway of her hips, the dress climbed a little higher up her ivory thighs. Even Heath could tell it had been made for someone smaller. Probably that sister of hers. Honestly, he liked it better this way. "Water?" Cordetta murmured. She sounded at most 10% awake. "Water." Heath let go of the knife and sighed. "Huh?" he groaned. "You want water, just go to the kitchen." But this answer didn't satisfy Cordetta. She tiptoed softly forward, hands clasped at her waist. "Water." She clutched at the air in front of her. Whatever that meant. Here, then. Heath tossed her his waterskin. Slightly groggy as he was, his throw was way off, but Cordetta plucked it out of the air with cat-like precision. Drink that." Cordetta held the waterskin in front of her face like she'd never seen one before. She came a little closer. At this distance, the degree to which her breasts strained the nightgown was apparent. Smooth as silk, they seemed at any moment as though they might spill out, especially whenever they rose with her breath. Cordetta poured the contents of the waterskin over her shoulders. Heath watched the droplets run down over the tops of her breasts and soak the lace over her bosom. She was more than a little sweaty. "You're supposed to drink it," Heath pointed out. She said. She started closing the distance between them. Heath felt a sudden desire to snatch up his knife again, but he repressed it. He thought of telling her to go away and stick her head in the tub, but seeing as her dress was so tight, he repressed that too. Honestly, he wasn't sure how he felt. As she drew closer, he saw her eyes open. They were hard and intent upon him. She took his hand and clasped it in both of hers. She didn't answer. Of course she didn't answer. Heath had never met a woman both so exhausting and so alluring. Cordetta sat on the edge of the hammock. It tilted with her weight, but held them both for the moment. Even so, Heath put a steadying hand on her hip. She planted her hands forcefully on his bare chest, then moved them to his shoulders. She stared into his eyes the whole time. Her auburn hair tumbled over her shoulders and rested at the tops of her breasts. "Come with me." Part of Heath thought that was a grand idea, whatever the destination, but another part mistrusted the look in her eyes. "I'm fine here. Thanks." He kept his hand on her hip, though. The fabric was soft, and the skin underneath surely softer. Then, with a resolution he wouldn't have expected even from a fully awake Cordetta, she twisted right while wrenching him left, and they both tumbled onto the floor, with Heath landing painfully on the bottom and Cordetta straddling him. "What the?" Heath said. "Since when did you—" Heath grabbed her upper arms to push her off, but loosened his grip when she brushed her cheek past his face to his ear. She whispered something he couldn't quite make out, softly touching his cheek with her lips. Heath closed his eyes for a moment to consider how nice it all was. Then she sat up, stalk straight on top of him. She ran her hands up his arms and settled on his shoulders, though she was a little too forceful, and her nails dug painfully into his deltoid. Her eyes burned into his with a deep candor. Too deep, somehow. Still, Heath prided himself on knowing a good thing when he saw it. He ran his fingers first softly through her hair, then pulled her head gently down toward his face. Cordetta leaned in and fixed her lips on the corner of his mouth. While Heath debated whether to turn inward toward her lips or away, he heard another odd noise on the ship. A furtive, creaking noise, almost like a footstep. That damn plaidie again, he decided. He also decided that the Crown Princess of Ellendale needed kissing, and turned his face in toward her soft pink lips. He pressed his lips against hers. They were warm, and flowed smoothly against his own like a perfect river of gold. He liked them so much better teasing softly at his lower lip than making closed-mouth smiles while throwing away his best shirts. Her thighs were warm too, and growing warmer the tighter she squeezed them against his hips. She was pressed against his lips like she was glued to them, pulling away on occasion to mumble indistinct sounds into his ear. Abruptly, Cordetta sat back up again. Somehow Heath doubted it was to help either of them breathe, but he took the opportunity to run his hands up her thighs to the crease of her hips. Her nightgown slid up in bunches along with his palms. For someone who never lifted a finger, she had great tone. At the press of his fingers, Cordetta pushed her hips flush against him. The dress threatened, promised, to tear, if only she would roll her hips just a little more. Heath slipped his hands into the curve of her waist, following it all the way up to the small of her back. His fingertips moved tantalizingly close to the border between Cordetta's clothes and her bare back. He could feel every move of her body and the gasping breaths and the heat burning under the fabric. Suddenly, Cordetta dove down beside his ear. "Heath, this isn't doing it for me," Cordetta husked, breathing hotly on his chin. "We should cool down in the lake." "This is doing just fine," Heath breathed heavily. He pulled her head toward his, but she resisted. "The lake, Heath," Cordetta insisted. "Don't you think we should get in the lake?" Cordetta were several hundred feet in the air. "We can swim, though. We can stay down there as long as we like." "We'll go for a swim tomorrow," Heath whispered softly in her ear. He leaned in to kiss her, but she pulled away. "I'll take the ship down and we can swim in the lake. Tomorrow." "Good?" "Agreed." He kissed the tender curves of her neck, moving his way up to her lips. Heath was savoring the light scent of lilac that clung to her throat when he noticed Bones creeping around the corner. She made slow blinking eye contact before scurrying past his head and tucking herself away in a corner. The floor creaked again, just like before, and not from anywhere near Bones, but it was getting closer. Heath pulled away from Cordetta. "Did you hear that?" Heath asked. "I think we should get up." "Yes, let's get up. And then we should go to the lake," Cordetta said, "and go for a nice long swim." She got up. Heath admired her fine, toned legs as he stood. She tried to pull him up, but he didn't need the help, so she just grasped the sides of his head. "We're not doing that swimming thing," Heath told her. Period. Cordetta seemed to make no acknowledgement of that. It occurred to Heath that she would normally get mad at being so flatly contradicted. Something was off here. And now the creaking sound above decks was growing louder. It sounded like it was coming from the pantry, where all the moonjade was, in that false-bottom compartment. Straining his ears, Heath could just make out the sound of smooth, pale stones being rummaged around in. Heath suspected a certain nightgown-wearing someone might not have closed it properly. Oh, damn my ears. The heat in him snuffed out in that instant. A terrible idea had come to him, but at least he thought he knew the solution. "Cordetta," he said, shaking her. Cordetta merely sighed pleasantly. "Cordetta, I know where there's water." Cordetta's face lit up. "Water? For swimming?" "Yeah, let's go to the water." "Yes. Heath, let's go now." Heath hurriedly scooped Cordetta up and slung her over his shoulder. He carried her quietly to the bathroom, where he sat her down in a shower. Then he picked up Bones's water bucket, which they'd agreed to keep in that room until the ideal bowl could be procured, and dumped it over her head. Cordetta awoke with a start. She looked down, taking in her soaked nightgown and then Heath's shirtlessness. Every inch of her was sopping wet, making the thin silk satin cling to her body. Her eyes widened with a feminine rage that even scared Heath a trace. A trace. "You freak!" she screamed at him. Heath winced. "You're a sick pervert, just trying to make my clothes see-through again. You disgust!" Heath raced back toward his hammock. Hey, I am talking to you!" Cordetta followed him in her dripping nightgown. "I wasn't finished. How dare you even dream of... You're just a debauchee with a big sword." But he wasn't paying attention. His eyes were fixed behind her. As it turned out, they hadn't been dealing with a Selkie after all. What Heath was seeing, coming up out of the shadows, was a creature even seep-scholars had long ago dismissed as an old wives' tale. Cordetta stamped her foot. Her hair lay flat against her cheeks and draped tight over her breasts. "This is the problem with men," she informed him. "You can't even do me the common courtesy of looking at me when I am talking to you. It's..." Heath grabbed his knife. "Like talking to rocks," and threw it at a point just over Cordetta's shoulder. Heath didn't bother watching it fly, though he did hear it strike home in something soft and squelchy. He was too busy grabbing his sword and pulling it from its sheath. Only then did Cordetta turn around and see. The princess did scream then, but first she dove into one of the several guest rooms. Good thing, because the Rusalka had claws like arrowheads, and when she brought them down on top of the place Cordetta had just vacated, they made the air whistle. The claws would have struck sooner, but Heath's knife had knocked the creature off balance. As Heath closed the distance, sword held point forward in an inside guard, the Rusalka licked her lips and hissed. Heath had heard of these things once, from an old woodsman who called them corpses with doll's eyes. He had not done them justice. Pitch black and white as a dinner spoon, those eyes hungered. The lack of any discernible pupils to show their direction gave them a mentally vacant look, but the mottled, almost waterlogged blue face around them supplied plenty of expression. The rest of her skin was a cold, clammy green. The muscles had grown in deep, serpentine grooves under the leathery surface, looking like a cross between tattoos and an exposed brain Heath had once seen. Long-limbed and gaunt, the Rusalka would have seemed equally at home crab-walking through an underwater cave or perched on a web inside a forest. She licked her lips again, and Heath saw a rictus of fangs parting for a serpentine-purple tongue. Sparse black hair hung limply off her scalp, in between angry blotches that looked to be some kind of rash-like disease. Several lumps of moonjade studded her right upper arm, which had caused it to grow longer, more muscular, and sprout those razor-sharp, bright green claws. Heath knocked twice on the ship's timbers. "See this? This is mine, and I don't like monsters on my ship." The Rusalka prodded the knife in her left shoulder with a single extended claw. Drawing the claw quickly back, she hissed. Heath grinned and dropped into a low guard. "Yeah, that's mine too." Heath moved first, with a thrust followed by a quick underhand cut. The Rusalka sidestepped the thrust and batted the cut aside with her claws. Then she repaid his efforts with a jab that might have torn out his throat, but Heath kicked her spindly leg out from under her, and it missed. The Rusalka hit the floorboards, hard. As Heath advanced, blade whirling before him, she crab-walked desperately backward. Those long limbs kept her moving at a good clip, even if one of them was out of proportion. As the Rusalka gained the stairs leading to the main deck, Heath closed the distance again with a series of lunges. The animal denizens of the sea, twisted as they were, remained animals, and that meant they were more afraid of him than vice versa, as they should be. The Rusalka ducked and weaved through all his attacks, then scrambled up onto the deck, spearing her claws into the steps in order to maintain her footing in the lashing rain. Heath was a man to favor the aggressive approach, but even he didn't like his odds chasing up those sloshing stairs into the claws on that right arm. He decided to go check on Cordetta instead. She was shaken but unhurt, hiding under the bed. Heath was surprised at how much relief that gave him. "Should I do anything?" Cordetta asked him. "Stay put. Keep hiding," he told her. Cordetta nodded numbly. A dull, rhythmic tapping sounded from the top of the stairs. Heath swept from the room to check on it. He found the Rusalka, waving her arms, daring him to come after her. A rhythmic gurgle emanated from her throat as she awaited his approach. "You'll get yours, freak," he promised the monster. He dashed for the ladder, betting the Rusalka hadn't figured out there was one. Sheathing his sword, he raced up the ladder with a speed that would have impressed a wildcat. By the time the Rusalka realized her mistake, he was already halfway up. She raced on 2.5 legs, working her longer freak arm in as best she could, toward the sound of climbing. But Heath was back on deck, sword again in hand, before she was close enough to stop him. He held his sword out for the monster to impale herself. The Rusalka dug her claws into the deck in an attempt to slow down. Big mistake. Knowing that 2 of her claws were occupied, even momentarily, gave Heath the only opening he'd need. He dove in, watching with split-second reflexes primed for the moment the Rusalka cocked her arms back to strike. There. The short arm tensed, ready to jab, and the long arm jerked sideways for a vicious swipe. Heath guessed the lowest that swipe could possibly go, then bent his knees and went lower. A single dip of his shoulder was all he needed to dodge the jab, and one 2-handed upward swing was all he needed to open the Rusalka's gut diagonally from hip to rib. The moment in which the leathery hide parted beneath his blade felt exquisite. Things weren't quite so pretty after that. Heath's duck turned into a forward slide on the wet timbers, right into the monster's leg. He collided with the monster's foot, too fast and too hard, and tumbled headlong past the monster, banging his shoulder painfully on the mast. But he was back on his feet quickly, whereas the Rusalka... The denizens of the seep did not bleed exactly. What they had was too viscous and too blue to be blood. It was so viscous that it was somewhat rare to see the fluid, since only the most grievous wounds even allowed it to flow. This was one of those. The Rusalka collapsed face down amid a spreading blue puddle. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, you like that? No more visits to Gilmere for you." Heath massaged his shoulder. He could tell already it was going to be tender tomorrow. "Heath!" Cordetta called as she ran up the stairs. Heath quickly took his hand off his shoulder and rested it casually against the mast. "Heath, do you need help?" "Do I look like I need help?" Heath said, flicking away a smear of blue that had wound up on his fingertips. "Okay, good," Cordetta said, rushing past him to inspect the Rusalka. She was carrying a tool bag in one hand and her moon torch in the other. "Ooh, still warm. The moonjade should still be enriched. I've read about this stuff. I'll be able to make some serious gadgets with this." She yanked out a glowing teal stone with all the grace of a discredited dentist. "Oh, and run down to the kitchen and grab some jars, would you? I don't know if this blue stuff has any useful properties, but you never know." "Better idea," Heath countered. "Why don't you grab the jars while I make sure this thing's good and properly—" Cordetta scoffed. "If you don't have the stomach, just say so." She pulled out a small vial from her tool bag and started dredging it through the puddle. She should have been watching the moonjade studding the Rusalka's arm. It twitched once, twice, then whiplashed straight for Cordetta's throat. "Cordetta, watch out," Heath might have said. But what would be the point? She never listened, and anyway she didn't have the reflexes. No, there was only one course of action. Heath dropped his sword and flung himself at her. The two of them rolled over and over, and when they came to a stop, Heath had to push himself off Cordetta with only one arm, his right. The other had been pierced deep by the Rusalka's claw. Good and properly dead, Heath finished at Cordetta. He dashed back to his sword, but the Rusalka had regained her feet by the time he had it. Though his sword was in hand, Heath hesitated. He could use his sword one-handed, but he was slower that way. Was the Rusalka also slower? She didn't look like she would be. The flow of blue from her chest had already stopped. His left arm howling with pain, Heath stood and bared his teeth to the monster. The Rusalka moved first. She jumped to the mast, then climbed high up into the rigging. She wasn't slower in the least. The Rusalka turned her gaze to Cordetta and barked a series of sounds that could almost have been speech. Heath glanced back at Cordetta to gauge her reaction, and her eyes, usually so sharp, had a foggy quality about them not unlike the seep. She set down her vial and cocked her head at an unnatural, almost childlike angle. "You were supposed to jump into the lake with me," she told Heath, without quite looking at him. "That way, nobody had to get hurt." "Sorry," he said, glaring back into the Rusalka's dead, blue-faced gaze. "Someone definitely has to get hurt here." He grabbed the vial at Cordetta's feet and flung it, high up at the Rusalka's face. His hunch, that this little trick the monster did required concentration, paid off as soon as the vial made contact. Cordetta's eyes and the tilt of her head returned to normal. "Ugh!" Cordetta yelled. "Heath, kill that thing!" She threw the Rusalka a furious glare, and dashed toward the stairs below decks. As soon as Cordetta was 15 steps away from Heath's protection, the Rusalka flung herself from the mast directly at Cordetta. Heath shouted in warning and charged. At the sound of Heath's shout, Cordetta turned, saw the Rusalka, and threw herself down the stairs. The Rusalka narrowly missed her, landing with bone-jarring impact. Heath's blade carved furious arcs in the rain, but the wind-up each one needed with only the one arm gave the Rusalka enough time to duck out of the way. Heath hoped to drive her to the edge, but the Rusalka crouched down, tensed her 3 longest limbs, and leaped clear over his head. Heath swung upward, but the Rusalka twisted like a cat, and a gleaming green claw bit sharply into Heath's left shoulder. The Rusalka grinned at him. She licked her lips, even tasted the blood on her claw. Heath charged her again, spinning into the lashing of her big arm and scoring a slash on her thigh. The Rusalka grabbed his throat and bared her fangs. Heath, thinking quickly, headbutted her in the mouth. As the Rusalka backed away again, rubbing her mouth, Heath swung again and again until he'd backed her up all the way to the mast. If she hadn't jumped back up into the rigging, he would have impaled her against the mast. "Cowardly little wretch," he bellowed up at her. "I'm going to split your skull open like a watermelon." The Rusalka spat several foul-smelling globs that landed like rotten plums on the deck all around him. It took Heath longer than it should have to realize she was trying to hit him with them. When he did, he noticed they were burning equally foul-smelling holes in the deck. "I'm going to fill those holes back up with your guts." He kicked the mast and strode over to the wheel. He'd shake that gangly freak off his ship if he had to barrel roll her. When the world turned upside down, Cordetta would just have to understand. Cordetta had other ideas, though. She was back up on deck, and she'd added the teal moonjade piece below the light emitter with a few twists of wire. "Get out of my head, freak!" She switched it on, and harsh aquamarine light flooded the rigging. The Rusalka gasped, bellowed, and then flexed all her muscles at once. Heath was unimpressed, and for a moment even convinced that Cordetta was making the Rusalka stronger. Then he saw the smoke rising off the seep fiend's skin, and the hate blazing in the gaping black eyes she dared not point toward the light. Oh hell. He grabbed Cordetta as the Rusalka, screeching like a bat, flung herself at the princess. Tossing his sword aside, he threw Cordetta one way and himself another. The Rusalka's impact cracked deck planks and, from the sound of it, possibly a shin bone or two. Not that any of that slowed her down. She turned so furiously to Cordetta that Heath knew there was no time to grab his sword. He tackled her from behind, slamming a half-Nelson around her muscular right shoulder. Cordetta scrabbled backward, her face white as the moon overhead, as the long green clawed arm swung and stabbed at her, narrowly missing only because Heath was wrenching the shoulder off course every time the arm went for her. She was stronger, Heath thought. That, or just desperate. The Rusalka stood abruptly and bucked him off, but he parlayed his fall into a roll and wound up where his sword had fallen. Cordetta had activated her moon torch again, poking out with its light beam while hiding behind the mast. The Rusalka, howling madly, was staggering toward her and paying him no heed. She drew her head back to spit acid at Cordetta. Heath, charging in from behind, severed her right leg above the knee with a single swing. He flipped his sword over in his hand and drove it through the Rusalka's right shoulder, pinning her to the deck. He planted a foot firmly on her other shoulder, beside his knife. The grooved muscles squirmed under his bare soles, somehow both rough and smooth. Though the Rusalka thrashed, she could no longer raise her arms, and her remaining leg lacked the reach to hurt him. Severing her right leg had been more than enough to induce rhythmic spurts of gloopy blue. The eyes spat hate, but soon even those were still. As the seep fiend ceased even to twitch, Cordetta looked from behind the mast as though the Rusalka might just get back up, pull her leg back on, and attack her. She held her moon torch trained too, and wisps of foul black smoke stung both their nostrils. She kept it on for a while before, with Heath's nodding encouragement, she worked up the guts to approach her fallen enemy. Cordetta prodded the Rusalka's hip with her big toe a few times, then folded her arms and leaned into her face. "And stay out!" she shouted. She started flicking the moon torch on and off in the Rusalka's face. "Cordetta, you steal my moonjade, you make me sleepwalk, you make me say dumb things, you make me cavort with sailors." Cavort was putting it mildly. However, Heath had a feeling Cordetta might be happier not knowing the details, at least right now. He put his hand on her shoulder. "Cordetta, it's dead." Cordetta shrugged his hand off, but at least she smiled. "Not quite, medically speaking," she said. She kicked its long arm. "See? The moonjade's still fresh, still glowing." She paused and looked mistrustfully at him. "Don't you dare finish it off." Heath gestured invitingly to the arm. Cordetta fetched her discarded tool bag and got to work prying, and soon had all her moonjade back, in shimmering aquamarine no less. Then she pulled the knife out of its shoulder and slammed it up to the hilt in its eye. "Now it's dead," Cordetta said, "and I, Princess Cordetta, killed it." As Heath watched her toss her head and smile over the corpse, his belly began to heave with laughter in spite of himself. "Yes, indeed," Heath said. Cordetta smiled softly at him, eyes shining. "Indeed." Cordetta left to restore the moonjade to her collection. Heath, knowing he'd get no more sleep tonight, wrapped his wounds up with some rags from below deck and went to the wheel. He spun the ship around and started it on the all-night voyage back to Gildmere. Cordetta came up after a while to spoon Rusalka blood into a glass jar. "Set the engine to full steam ahead, if you please," Heath told her. "Oh, and apologize to our figurehead for me." Cordetta looked up from her goop collecting with confusion. "What? Why?" "Because she's about to have company."